Diane Vegas is a monster.
How's the timeline? Okay.
Diane
Sound
Vegas, we
speeds.
good?
Michael Eric Dyson, Finding the Funk, take 2.
You know what I asked you about was about Detroit.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that you'd grown up there in the
Right,
city.
right.
Now, most historians of music, including myself,
Right.
made the mistake when I wrote my Motown book. It's like, well, Detroit's over for music.
Right,
but in
right.
fact, what's the untold story that what we will tell
Right.
is that the next movement out of Motown was P-Funk.
Oh yeah, right, exactly.
Talk about what Detroit was like in the 70s.
Oh, Detroit was amazingly rich in sound. You know, we had seen our high point. People said, well, your apotheosis is over. Y'all, you know, when Michael Jackson and them headed out and went up to, with Mary Gordy out to L.A., it was over for Detroit. You know, you had the assembly line left, and then you know, the shift from manufacturing to service industry was going to kill that. So Detroit's over. No, because we got techno, and we got the funk scene. And techno and funk are really interesting elements that are deriving again from the rejection of a narrow conception of soul music. Disco is yet to come into existence. So funk music is occupying a space where we're literally dealing with the sense of depression by Motown's departure and by the shift in the automobile industry and the loss of a manufacturing base at its beginning, and the funk music begins to express that. The kind of nervousness about newfound success, but also the loss of a certain kind of cohesive narrative that Motown provided. As long as Motown is literally in Detroit, our musical identity is set. And we're kind of lazy. We don't even have to really rely on anything except that. But when it departs, we begin to search and look, which is what funk music is about. Funk music is about a perennial quest for new forms of expression and new forms of self-expression. And I think that in Detroit there, it was very powerful. You had black working class people and upwardly mobile black people who still maintained a gritty relationship to the roots that produced them. You know, you had these VFW clubs, you had the discos, you had the haunts, you had the little after hours clubs. Remember in 1967, one of those after hours clubs led to the riot and something that happened there. So, you know, there were plenty of spaces of recreation left in Detroit. And funk music grew out of this. I mean, house later on in Chicago, but the techno scene was produced by people's sense of intimate familiarity with their environments, but as the technology began to process our relationship to the environment. And funk at a certain level is changed by that, but also expresses that. So in Detroit, man, I remember once I was working as a janitor. That wasn't no summer job, that's what I was doing. And I was on my way to work, and the Brides of Funkenstein, right? These three women stopped like, oh my God, our cars broke down and we need a ride to the studio. And I was like, well, who are any of the brides? I was like, oh my God, of course, you know. And so I got a chance to, you know, take them to the studio. That was my claim to fame with the P-Funk out of Detroit, man. But they are an untold story about what happened and how Detroit actually moved beyond the kind of soul music stylings of Motown.
Were people in Detroit aware that George and the people were basing or making their music out of Detroit?
Right. You know, yeah, people had a local sense of pride that this guy, you know, every time we hear, that's our guy, man. I mean, y'all, we don't identify with him. We don't get identified with him. And plus, his Afro-Bohemianism was a challenge to the church aesthetic that was so deeply entrenched there. But there was still pride. There was still like, that's our cousin, right? That's our man. That's our guy. And he's doing great work and he's doing great music. And so there was an appreciation for it, even if there wasn't a readily available set of experiences that we could understand him through. So we didn't have a vocabulary to articulate what he was doing because, heck, he was doing it himself. He was rapidly expanding. And the beautiful thing about him is that he was constantly looking for the next thing. I mean, the greatest word in black creativity is next, because you can never anticipate what's coming, but you know something is. And I think George Clinton was on the cutting edge of that.
You know, this makes me, you know, we should talk about a bit.
What's that?
Magnificent Mojo.
Oh, right.
Because I think the Detroit music of that era,
right,
and the Detroit audience,
right,
was very, whoops, watch, ladies, pillows, yeah, was very progressive,
right,
and I think that he was a big part of it.
Yeah, he was. I'm trying to think, where was he? He was on. Trying to what state? Yeah, I'm trying to think of where he was. Yeah, station. All right. Yeah, when you think about Magnificent Mojo, you know, the beautiful thing about Magnificent Mojo is that these DJs still had tremendous power. This is when they were local, when they were listened to, and that the music that they exposed us to was tremendous. You know, you had Magnificent Mojo, after him, Butterball Jr. It's not the size of the ship that makes you seasick, it's the motion of the ocean. So that they're explaining rhetorically what's happening musically. But Magnificent Mojo was critical because he gets people to listen and he gives a stamp of approval, which is extremely important because when you're trying to deal with transition and you're trying to figure out something new, the thing you look to is, well, this person is a reliable guide. So he became a reliable guide to opening up our ears sonically to new sounds and new developments where that funk, which was resisted, because don't forget, if funk is about bad body odor, it's also about stuff that's taboo, that's a little bit, tendentious. We don't know how to deal with that. Daggum, maybe we would back up off of it. So you needed somebody to be a kind of emissary of acceptance for an art form that George Clinton and P-Funk are doing, and then dividing your groups brilliantly up, between Parliament, Funkadelic, P-Funk. I mean, that was just amazing, and I think Mojo had an extraordinarily important role in at least facilitating an awareness of those musical forms in Detroit.
One of the things interesting, and this segues into Prince, what I remember when Prince first came out in the 80s, that Detroit was in fact his biggest market.
Oh yeah.
And he would start his tours. I remember I saw the Purple Rain tour.
Right.
Began at the
Cobo Hall. Yeah. Cobo Hall. Yeah.
And that's why I thought about Mojo, because I feel like there was something. They were a little more open, Detroit. It seemed like as a music town.
Oh yeah, because you're so right. Detroit was fertile territory for a guy like Prince because Mojo is plowing that ground. Black people feel a sense, look, we have a sense of loss. Motown's gone. So we have to be identified with the next great thing. There was a bit of desperation for us to grasp onto our cutting edge sensibilities. We'd lost them, and not only to Motown, not only Motown to LA, but what Philly International was doing, because Philly International ultimately gives rise to disco and some interesting funk on its own. So we had to have a sense of competition. Hey, we're not just the afterthoughts anymore. So we were prepared because we were feeling a sense of loss, but also because I think Detroit just had those down home, Alabama displaced, Georgia displaced black folk who were still looking for some funk in their souls and spirits and looking to express it in their existences. And they felt second generation more comfortable with it. See, first generation Negroes who are displaced from the South are much more rigid and conservative because they're trying to preserve what they lost. There's a sense of nostalgia. But second, third generation is like, what it is. Where can we get it? How can we open it up? So there's a kind of rambunctious, rebellious attitude. There's a kind of elegant irreverence that's going on. And I think funk music represented that. And Prince tapped straight into that. Why? Because he's got all those religious sensibilities. He's got a worldview that is manically irreverent, but at the same time draws from the religious forms of ecstasy that have informed all these Christian ideas. So he was just like a barometer of where the culture was going in terms of funk and its openness to or resistance against the ideas that he was dealing with.
It's curious. I was going to ask you then too about let's segue a bit into musicianship.
Right.
Reagan came in the 80s.
Right.
And you began seeing for the last 30 years a consistent cutback in the amount of money for music education. It's seen irrelevant. I mean, I've heard Republicans say, "Why are we paying for music education?"
Right, exactly. Oh, it's
What do you think the impact of that has been on black music?
Man, black music itself has been deeply shaped in a fundamental way by cuts in budgets. Look, when I was a kid in Detroit, I was born in '58. So we were poor, but you could rent for low rates instruments at the school. So I played the clarinet till 9th grade, first chair. My brother played trumpet. So we could rent those kind of instruments. I can remember taking them home. Oh my God, putting the grease on there, getting the reed, playing music. Dun, 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 dun. We knew it. We got Mr. Kirby, the white band leader, and we're playing along, and we're reading the music. We're actually in touch with the kind of musical instruments that produce the sounds that we loved. But as it comes in the late 70s, early 80s, with the rise of Reagan as America's grandfather, the grand paternal figure who reigned over American culture, stuff changes big time. Arts budgets are cut. We don't, ketchup is made a vegetable according to Ronald Reagan, so poor people don't really need to eat. And my God, what do you need instruments for? That's frivolous. We could be doing something serious like shunting you toward vocational school to teach you to go to wood shop so you can make some stuff for us and help us out and hook us up with the things we need. But nothing about your inherent education and nothing about the arts as a way to sustain human desire to grow. So all that changed. So when I see, people say, you young black kids can't play, of course they can't play. They have no instruments to which they've had access. The budgets have been cut. The desire for art has been shunted to the periphery. And as a result of that, these people, ingeniously to me, do something different. They make instruments out of technological, they make instruments out of technology so that they make them sing in a certain way. They bring humanity to these instruments. And I think that out of necessity, it's like Immanuel Kant, making a virtue out of necessity. They made a virtue out of necessity. They were denied access to these instruments, as you know, more than anybody in America, with the downturn in the economy in the early 80s and the rise of Reaganomics and trickle-down economy and George Gilder economics. None of that stuff wasn't trickling down to black people. So with the infusion of Kool Herc and all these Caribbean people with their sonic booming systems from the Caribbean plugging up, amping up, that stuff begins to change the sonic landscape. And so they began to treat those technological forms as instruments. The turntables that get generated out of fixing, black kids being sent to white schools and vocational schools to fix the broken down turntables of white kids spawns a revolution, because now they figure out how to put them side by side. They begin to use the technology for the advantage, and they begin to play those technological forms as instruments. Record players become instruments, scratching, looping, cycling, all repetitious forms, all forms, which is why hip-hop is going to be deeply influenced by funk, because they have similar preoccupations with repetition and circularity and vamping and taking a break beat and moving on. So I think that it has had a profound effect. And one of the great things is it has taught young people to make do with what they have, what the anthropologists called a bricoleur. That is a person who's out there like taking leftovers and doing stuff with them. But the problem is, of course, is that unlike, say, the Roots or some other groups that have live performances, that they have not learned those instruments and not learned to play those instruments. And we've seen a dearth of that in this generation. But to jump on them without understanding the political economy of the production of music and how those budgets shortfalls affected black people, the bigger bands. Well, we used to have all these funk bands with 8, 9, 10 people, Tower Power, you got 3, trombone over here and flugel and all that. All that stuff gets cut down because you're making it on a computer now. It still has some advantages, but it begins to cut against the grain of black people learning instruments, playing with each other, and the soulful democracy that was the adjunct of funk music.
So one of the things that's really interesting has been to go and see where funk is now.
Yeah.
In terms of people who are playing in a traditional style.
Right.
And most of the bands I see that, and they're good,
yeah,
are white, or predominantly white bands.
It's like the blues, man. I mean, funk music has gone the way virtually of the blues, in the sense that the people who are its greatest technicians, the people who are its greatest advocates, the people who are its unapologetic and most arduous supporters happen to be white kids who were who were reared on this music, who found the source of the stuff they liked in the funk music and wanted to play the original funk music itself, went back to the roots, so to speak. I mean, the same way Mick Jagger has to pay acknowledgement to the blues musicians that came before him, or Rod Stewart acknowledging, Otis Redding, or Chuck Berry, the greatest writer in rock music, bar none. They have to go back to the sources, and these white kids with a sense of ardor, and in one sense with a greater sense of permission to do so, a greater sense of freedom. It doesn't cost as much in terms of their cultural capital to be associated with the black music in the way that it might cost some other black people. So there's some complicated explanations for that.
Why do you say that there's a cost for you?
This is what I mean. So that if you're associated with a distinctly black form of music that is seen as passe and stuff, and you're a black person, it's like Barack Obama. Bill Clinton can afford to be more black in public than can Barack Obama, because it doesn't cost Bill Clinton the same thing to be black, because he ain't black. And since he ain't black and he's only playing black on television, he gets away with a lot more of expression. He can go on Arsenio and play the saxophone. He can go, I feel your pain. He can do black isms and go to black churches. And look, I saw him at the funeral of Ossie Davis. Pimp walk up Riverside Church, get to the pulpit and go, I wish I knew what it meant to be free. Negroes went crazy. He has permission as a white man to enact the tropes and the themes of blackness without consequence than a Barack Obama. So black musicians pay a certain kind of price, even though they've been freer than our other intellectuals for the most part, but there's a price to be paid for being pigeonholed and narrowly constrained by music that when white musicians come along and begin to experiment with it, it gets changed. So that Bo Diddley is doing one thing, the Rolling Stones are doing another. And when you look at the 500 greatest albums and Rolling Stone, the first Beatles, Rolling Stone, I think Marvin Gaye jumps in there, number 6 or 7 or something, then black folk fall off. So the appropriation of this music by white artists has not only been granted greater permission to them, they've also had the ability to exploit it economically and commercially and make greater uses of it. And it's a great irony. It's one of the consequences of racism, even as liberal white sensibilities allow white people to take over that music and appreciate it for what it was.
Wow, that's a lot. Let's go. I want to go to the albums. Let's
Right.
pick up some of the albums and see what they spark in your memory.
Wow,
Let's
man.
look to the camera.
I mean,
What
Superfly,
did that say to you?
Curtis Mayfield. I mean, this is Fred is Dead. I mean, when I think about this music here, I think about a guy who was a tremendously transitional figure. Curtis Mayfield, the Impressions, that 3-part, 4-part harmony that they were known for, the angelic sounds of the church married to the ghetto sensibilities of the street. So when you hear, I mean, aside from what's going on, this may be the greatest theme album. Man, I'm sorry. No, sorry about that. Room service? Okay, cut. Yeah, room service.